I've visited almost every country in Europe, and while most places turned out pretty much as I expected, a few completely surprised me. These are 11 European destinations I didn't expect to love. I'm Roger from priceoftravel.com, and let's start with Liverpool. Back in 2012, I was planning to live in Manchester for 3 months, but after arriving I discovered that finding a short-term apartment there was almost impossible. So instead, I ended up spending 2 months traveling around Britain and visiting around 20 different cities. And the biggest surprise of that trip was Liverpool. No one really talks about Liverpool as a tourism destination unless they're specifically interested in the Beatles, so I was expecting a gruff port city that had been in decline for decades. Instead, I found a handsome and vibrant city with an abundance of notable architecture, charming streets, and a surprising number of cultural attractions. I thoroughly enjoyed the Beatles story attraction, took a bus tour, and visited several memorable pubs that were packed even in the middle of the day. To be honest, I expected more from Manchester and didn't find many sights beyond Old Trafford, while Liverpool felt more attractive and more interesting almost immediately. I wouldn't plan an entire Britain trip around Liverpool, but if you've got a couple extra days, I think it's one of the country's most underrated stops. The following year, I was living in Serbia for a while and taking weekend trips around the region. Most of the larger cities felt fairly similar to me, but Sarajevo stood out almost immediately. For starters, it has a beautiful setting in a valley between two mountain ranges, even more impressive in person than it looks in this footage. Trivia fans may remember that Sarajevo hosted the Winter Olympics in 1984, and the surrounding mountains still give the area a bit of a ski town feel. But what surprised me the most was the atmosphere in the historic center. Right in the heart of town is a large mosque complex, yet within a short walk you'll also find churches, cathedrals, and other religious landmarks. Sarajevo has long been known for its mix of cultures and religions, and it feels very different from almost any other city in the region. One thing I'll never forget is having a couple of $1 local beers just steps from the entrance to the main mosque. I've traveled in many Muslim countries, and that's not something you're likely to experience in most of them. Sarajevo is also popular with visitors from the Middle East and elsewhere, so it has a unique energy that makes it stand out from the crowd. I expected another interesting Balkan city, but Sarajevo ended up feeling unlike anywhere else I'd been. Several years earlier, I found myself in Athens and wanted to rent an apartment for a couple of weeks so I could get some work done. While looking into my options, I discovered that the closest Greek resort island was Aegina, just a 40-minute ferry ride from the port of Piraeus. I'd never even heard of it, and a few days later I found myself there. You might expect an island so close to Athens to be crowded and overdeveloped, but that wasn't my experience at all. I visited in early April before the summer season had started, so most of the resort hotels were still closed and the island felt like it belonged to the locals. I rented a motorbike several times and explored all over the island, passing pistachio groves, small villages, and even the ruins of a 2,500-year-old temple. Everywhere I went felt relaxed, friendly, and surprisingly authentic. Maybe I got lucky by visiting just before the season began, but Aegina ended up being one of the most pleasant Greek islands I've ever visited. Instead of taking a long ferry ride to one of the famous islands, I found a charming and beautiful place almost right on Athens' doorstep. I expected a convenient place to get some work done for a couple of weeks. What I found was one of the biggest surprises of my time in Greece. On another trip, I visited Helsinki, then took the ferry to Tallinn and continued on to Riga before finally reaching Vilnius. I was enjoying all three Baltic capitals and honestly expected Vilnius to feel very similar to the other two. Instead, it ended up being my favorite of the bunch. Tallinn and Riga are both beautiful cities with impressive historic centers, but they're also major cruise destinations. That means plenty of gift shops, happy hour bars, and businesses catering to people who are only in town for a few hours. Vilnius felt noticeably different. It's so far inland that it's almost on the border with Belarus, and that seems to have helped it retain a more local and authentic atmosphere. The city felt a bit cheaper, a bit less polished, and a lot less dependent on tourism. There are historic churches, castles, and plenty of attractive streets to explore, but what I remember most is the feeling that I had stumbled into a real city rather than a tourist destination. Even the famous Frank Zappa statue, which stands in a random parking lot for reasons I still don't fully understand, somehow fits the vibe. I enjoyed all three Baltic capitals, but Vilnius is the one that surprised me the most and the one that I remember most clearly today. In a past life, I worked for the Daily Racing Forum, so whenever I traveled, I often tried to visit local racetracks. On one August trip to France with some horse racing friends, we decided to spend a few days in Deauville because its famous racing meet only runs during that month. Deauville is kind of the Saratoga of Europe, if that means anything to you, so I expected it to be incredibly expensive, incredibly pretentious, and full of people who didn't want me there. Instead, I found one of the most pleasant seaside towns in France. The racetrack itself is surprisingly small, and the crowds were a good mix of everyday racing fans and wealthy owners. More importantly, the town is gorgeous, with half-timbered buildings that almost reminded me of an alpine village rather than a beach resort. Better still, Deauville has a wide sandy beach, which is more than can be said for many of the towns along the French Riviera. The restaurants and hotels felt high quality without being outrageously expensive, and the whole place was far more welcoming than I expected. I arrived expecting a summer playground for the wealthy, but left wondering why more visitors don't talk about Deauville. It's one of the few places on this list that I'm absolutely certain I will visit again. Kaš isn't technically in Europe, and I suspect most viewers have never heard of it, so I'll keep this one short. Years ago, I was traveling through Asia and looking for a small beach town where I could rent an affordable apartment for a month or two, and I stumbled into Kaš and ended up staying for 13 months. Kaš is a former fishing village on a small peninsula along Turkey's Mediterranean coast, not far from Antalya. It has a gorgeous harbor, several nice beaches, and a storybook historic center filled with winding streets and outdoor restaurants. One of my favorite things about the town was how history seemed to be everywhere. Ancient ruins are scattered throughout the area, including a remarkably well-preserved amphitheater right on the edge of town. And because there are several mosques in the historic center, you'll often hear the call to prayer echoing across town at slightly different times. I originally arrived looking for a cheap place to spend a few weeks. Instead, I found a town I loved so much that I stayed for more than a year. I still have friends there today, and if you ever find yourself along Turkey's Mediterranean coast, I highly recommend visiting. On that same trip around Britain, I also spent a few days in Glasgow. If you tell someone you're planning a trip to Scotland, they'll usually recommend Edinburgh first, then perhaps Inverness for the Highlands, or St Andrews if you're a golfer. Scotland's largest city rarely makes the list. Because of that, I arrived with fairly modest expectations. Instead, I found a city that was far more attractive and interesting than I expected. Glasgow has a beautiful pedestrianized shopping district at its center, along with impressive churches, museums, municipal buildings, and some surprisingly striking modern architecture. What stood out most was how lively and authentic the city felt. Unlike Edinburgh, which can sometimes feel overwhelmed by tourism during the summer months, Glasgow felt like a place that primarily existed for the people who lived there. From what I could tell, Glasgow is also something of Scotland's cultural capital. With a thriving arts scene that includes opera, ballet, music, and theatre, there always seems to be something happening. I still wouldn't tell someone to skip Edinburgh and spend their entire vacation in Glasgow instead, but I do think Glasgow deserves far more attention than it gets, and it ended up being one of the biggest surprises of my time in Scotland. After visiting Lisbon about 20 years ago, I was in the mood for somewhere quieter, and I think I first read about Tavira in a Rick Steves guidebook. Since it sits in Portugal's Algarve region, I was expecting another beach destination that had long ago been overtaken by what one of my English friends calls sunshine tourism. Instead, I found a gorgeous, whitewashed town with cobblestone streets, elegant squares, and a wide river flowing right through the center. It felt more like a historic Portuguese town than a beach resort. What surprised me most was the history. Tavira's roots go back nearly 3,000 years. Considering that the California city where I grew up was founded in 1957, I just wasn't expecting that level of history and character in a relatively small coastal town. There were certainly other visitors around, but Tavira still felt like a real place rather than a tourist playground. The shops, restaurants, and bars seemed to exist primarily for their local residents rather than the visitors passing through for a few days. Not every beach town in southern Europe has managed to preserve that feeling, and we'll talk about one of those a little later. But Tavira was one of the most pleasant surprises I've had in Portugal, and a place I'd happily return to. Let's head out into the Atlantic and talk about Iceland. To be honest, I've always been more of a city person than a nature person. I usually travel for culture, history, architecture, and food rather than scenery. At the time, I'd heard Reykjavik had become something of a nightlife capital, with bars and clubs going late into the night, so I booked a 9-day trip to Iceland without making many plans in advance. What I discovered was that Reykjavik really wasn't for me. Compared to other European capitals, I found it a bit dull, and the drink prices were so astronomical that there was no way I was going to be partying all night anyway. So after a couple of days, I rented a car and set off around Iceland's Ring Road by myself, and that decision completely changed the trip. Iceland is easily the most beautiful and unusual place I've ever visited. The landscapes seem to change every hour with volcanoes, waterfalls, black sand beaches, glaciers, lava fields, and scenery that often looked more like another planet than somewhere on Earth. At least when I visited, there were so few tourists that I would occasionally stop in the middle of the road to take a photo because the nearest car might be 20 minutes behind me. The tiny villages where I stayed in simple guest houses were each more charming than the last, and outside Reykjavik, the trip was surprisingly affordable because self-catering was often the easiest option. I know Iceland is much more popular now than it was then, but I suspect the quieter northern stretches of the Ring Road still have some of that same magic. I expected a fun city break with some interesting scenery on the side. Instead, I found one of the most memorable travel experiences of my life. Another city that completely caught me off guard was Ljubljana. Before visiting, I had already spent time in Belgrade and Zagreb. I enjoyed both of them well enough, but neither left a huge impression on me, so I wasn't expecting much from Slovenia's capital. Then I stepped off the train and almost immediately realized I was wrong. Ljubljana is one of the most charming cities I've ever visited. The compact historic center is built around a lovely river that winds through town with outdoor cafes lining the waterfront and a castle perched on the hill above it all. It felt picturesque from almost every angle. What's funny is I don't even remember many of the specific sights. Instead, I remember how the city made me feel. Within an hour or two, I found myself wondering how much a furnished apartment might cost because it seemed like the sort of place where I could easily spend a few months. At least when I visited, Ljubljana was also quite affordable and small enough that you could explore most of the center on foot in a day or two. It felt relaxed, welcoming, and far more beautiful than I expected. Just when I thought I had a pretty good idea what another former Yugoslav capital would be like, Ljubljana completely surprised me. And as a bonus, the rest of Slovenia is gorgeous as well, but that's a topic for another video. Last up is a destination that might be a little controversial, especially if you've been there before. It's Torremolinos on Spain's Costa del Sol. The Costa del Sol has a reputation for package tourism, all-day drinking, and visitors who seem determined to recreate Britain while technically being somewhere else. To be honest, I arrived expecting the worst. And yes, there were certainly plenty of souvenir shops, bars advertising drink specials, and other reminders that this is one of Europe's most famous beach destinations. But what surprised me the most was how pleasant and relaxed the area felt once I got beyond those stereotypes. I visited in October, which is shoulder season but still warm enough for the beach, and by then most of the summer crowds had disappeared. The beaches themselves are excellent, and the long seaside promenade connecting several of the neighboring towns makes the whole area remarkably easy to explore on foot. I've seen videos from places like Magaluf and Benidorm that honestly still look a bit horrifying to me, so perhaps my expectations were simply very low. But I ended up enjoying Torremolinos far more than I expected and found myself appreciating the simple pleasures of good weather, long walks by the sea, and a surprisingly relaxed atmosphere. That's really the theme of this whole video. Sometimes the destinations you expect to love end up disappointing you, while the ones you almost skip become places you remember most, and Torremolinos was definitely one of those surprises. So those were 11 European destinations that I didn't expect to love, but ended up becoming some of my favorite travel memories. One thing I've learned over the years is that the places you remember most aren't always the ones you expect. I'd love to hear about some destinations that surprised you, whether they're in Europe or somewhere else, so let me know in the comments. This one was a bit more personal than my usual videos, so thanks for watching all the way to the end. And if you enjoyed it, please give it a like and subscribe for more Europe travel videos. I'll see you in the next one.